We're going to pick up here with value chain analysis. Just coming up with and devising our organizational cost structure and our competitive advantage isn't enough. We have to continue to reassess that and control our costs. We are ever now, while it's important not to, as they say, fix something that's not broken, by the same token, you've always got to be striving to build a better mousetrap. Otherwise, your client, you kind of become stale in the marketplace, and the next the next cool thing on the market is going to eclipse you. You want to absolutely exploit the internal linkages and understanding what the drivers are, and the internal value chain. So we've got all the way from design to service following the supply. We want to have feedback. We want to know, well, are we getting service issues related to a particular thing, therefore we need to modify our design process. And so service not only is an opportunity for us to stay engaged with our customers, but to understand how we need to potentially modify the design of a product going forward, and what customers find as being valued rather than what we might think. It is particularly critical to exploit supplier linkages. In other words, making sure that you have strategic partners in your buying process. And I know that I have a tendency to sometimes negotiate a cost of something and then get busy because it's just me and I lose sight of it. And without really realizing it, the cost that I was paying for something isn't really a good deal because somebody else has come up with a better mousetrap. And I think probably a great example of that is my phone system. When I first chose my hosted PBX voice over IP system, it was cutting edge. I was the first business in my community to move over to this kind of technology, and it was great. It did everything I wanted it to do, and so it was a set it and forget it. Very recently, I had an opportunity to consult with an attorney on some product upgrades, and it caused me to look around a little bit more at what is out there in the marketplace. And she had a phone system that was, I kid you not, I was probably in high school when they produced it. And it was very much time. And what we found for her, I come back and look at my phone system and I think, oh, I wish I had what she had, because she's got all kinds of fancy bells and whistles. Meanwhile, my previously cutting edge provider didn't really keep up with the technology. There is not a companion app for my phone that I can turn my smartphone into a clone of my desk computer so that if I'm sitting in court and I need to call a client or a witness, it looks like it's coming from my office. And yes, I know there are clone features you can use for that, but these phone systems actually have apps built in that mimic the desktop phone. And there were all kinds of different value-added features that my phone provider just doesn't offer me. And now I'm left with the decision, and frankly, she gets it for a better cost, is the disruption of making the shift, because there's nothing wrong with my phone. It rings, I answer it, it still does all the things that it did in the beginning. But is the disruption worth the benefit potentially of having some additional value-added features? So far, I have not been willing to bite the bullet and have my phone system disrupted, even temporarily, for a shift. But it's something that I certainly think a lot about, and now I think about the fact that when I pay my bill every month, that I'm actually now paying more for less than I could get someplace else. But for the potential disruption to my clients in shifting over to a different system entirely, I would drop them like a hot potato. So basically we can, managing the procurement of products and services and being able to trace objects that we purchase right down to the unit will allow us to do the best costing that we possibly can. Now, there is just a point at which some estimates are going to have to occur, because tracing every last, nut, bolt, screw, whatever, down to every individual product, the cost of doing that wouldn't really be supported by the data that you would get from it. So to the extent that the effort to trace the products is justified by the savings that could be done by the cost control, then it's certainly worth doing. Managing customer costs, particularly important, because if we treat all of our customers the same, some customers will cost us money and some will make us money. Let's say, for example, we had a flat delivery charge, and didn't matter how much you ordered or how far we traveled, it was the same delivery charge. Now, I'm sure it doesn't take a lot of math to think, well, if we've got to send a truck out and that truck is going to make a 50-mile round trip and we charge the same delivery fee, obviously that's going to eat into our profits because the truck's away longer, not able to do other things that are in closer proximity, and there's a greater cost of not only the driver but the fuel, the maintenance, all of that on the vehicle. On the other hand, if we're, charging to somebody down the street, or the same fee, that may be more profitable. On the other hand, what if that long distance person is buying 5 times more than the person down the street? Then these costs may balance themselves out. But those are things that you need to think about when you're assigning costs to customers. And while you certainly you need to identify your unprofitable customers and either get rid of them or do something to make them profitable. But continuing to serve unprofitable customers, really at the expense of your profitable customers, doesn't serve anyone. It's also important to understand the product life cycle, excuse me, and the various viewpoints. Uh, there is a revenue producing life cycle and a consumable life cycle. If you take into account the sponges that I buy for my kitchen sink, I probably buy those sponges because those are the sponges my mother bought. And I don't think that those sponges have changed at all since I was a small child watching my mother do dishes. And that's what's familiar to me, so that's what I bought. Consequently, that product, the revenue producing cycle from when they designed that sponge, it has continued. That same design has held out for, and may for generations. On the other hand, the consumable life cycle of that very same sponge is very short. I don't know how long a sponge lasts in your kitchen, but I probably keep mine around longer than I should. So we want to make sure that we assess our life cycle viewpoints from both a marketing orientation as well as a production orientation. When we're looking at the marketing of the viewpoint of a product life cycle, during the introduction phase, we will have pretty limited sales. The sales ideally will peak at some point, whatever we decide the maturity of the product is, and then we'll start to decline. At that point, we need to, and frankly, before we get to this point, we need to start thinking about product revisions. For something like my handy dandy kitchen sponge, that maturity point has really stretched out over a pretty extensive amount of time, and I don't know at what point people will decide that kitchen sponges are no longer adequate and demand something new and better, but certainly car manufacturers have a particular sensitivity to this, and you buy a car in the first year of that model and it, maybe people are a little, unsure of how that looks. Does that really look odd? Well, as you get used to seeing more of them on the road, it becomes more popular, more accepted, and then suddenly they're everywhere. Then the market sort of hits a point of saturation and people start to go, wasn't as cool as I thought, or, it's kind of tired and it needs a reboot. And lo and behold, the auto manufacturers will come out with maybe the next model with more chrome, or maybe it's a sleeker design, who knows? But certainly the the continuum of the sponge to automaker, sponge is certainly on one end, and autos, new models of vehicles are certainly on the opposite end of the marketing viewpoint of the product life cycle. We also have a production viewpoint. We've got life cycle costs, and quite often our costs begin before revenue is even on the horizon. Most products begin with research and development, a testing phase, all of those things. And during that time, costs are going in, money's going in one direction and no one's buying until we have perfected that point. And then there's often revisions that go on. So again, we begin with our sort of our ramp up in our research, planning, design, testing, and then once we get the product into production and logistics, we've probably incurred 100% of the life cycle costs unless we are involved in some sort of a decommissioning requirement on the other end of something. The consumable life cycle viewpoint is where we do start to take decommissioning costs into account. I had done some work at some point for a solar developer, and those solar fields are, they exist for anywhere between 20 to 35 years that you're going to get good power production from those. But what are you left with at the end of the project? Well, you're left with probably concrete in the ground to support the posts. You've got a bunch of panels out there, and the whole cost of the project, the state doesn't want people to just walk away from these things when they're no longer income producing and just leave a bunch of dead solar panels in fields all over the place and just go, buy a new property and, don't bother to decommission the old one and just, continue to create new panels. So decommissioning plans have to be created as part of the permitting process so that the state can ensure that they're not going to suddenly have the countryside populated with spent solar fields at some point in the future. So in this case, again, not only are we looking at design, development, basically installation and operation, but maintenance and disposal costs in those for those types of projects. And there's all kinds of products in which maintenance and disposal need to be calculated into it, as opposed to those in which the product is produced, handed over to the customer, and the manufacturer is really hands off after that. So in the life cycle management, where service and decommissioning are part of the project, that needs to be absolutely incorporated into the life cycle of these. So our marketing viewpoint is obviously revenue oriented, whereas our production viewpoint is going to be cost oriented, and our consumable life cycle viewpoint is customer value oriented. Are we going to continue, or again, are we going to push this product out into the marketplace and not stand behind it, or are we going to continue to support it going forward and offer updates or revisions as needed? And I know this video is getting long, but I just want to touch on these next two slides before I cut this short. Basically, these next two slides, and you can pause these or go back, but basically these kind of put into words the graphs that we looked at earlier, and the how those would be, charted in terms of their peaks and declines and for the various activities. So I'm going to stop this here and go on to the next video.